I don't know about you, but I like dice. The sound they make when they roll across a table or skitter across the floor, the way they look alien to some people the first time they see them, the way some say they resemble gems or precious stones, the way they defend characters stalwartly or betray them to an early and undeserving demise. But most of all, it's the mystery, the mythos, and the superstition that surrounds them. Dice are the player's physical connection to the game world itself. It allows them to interact and let their decisions have meaning and value. The randomness of the dice gives the judge or game master a means of neutrality when objectivity gets muddled, when beloved characters come up against odds that can at best be described as unfair. But dice are also imbued with a sort of mysticality that's been handed down over thousands of years. Since as early as possibly the 2nd century BC, Egyptians were using 20-sided dice to either play a complex game of which no written record remains, or to commune with the very gods themselves. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City has in its possession, as their website describes, quote, a number of polyhedral dice made in various materials that have survived from the Hellenistic and Roman periods, usually from ancient Egypt when known. Another remarkable example, discovered in the Dakhlia oasis in Egypt in the 1980s, records an Egyptian god's name in Timatic, the Egyptian script of these late periods, on each face. Divination, seeking advice about the unknown from the supernatural, seems to be the most likely purpose for the Dakhlia dice. The polyhedron might have been thrown in order to determine a god who might assist the practitioner. End quote. So, using dice to communicate with other worlds invented or passed down is, in a way, part of human heritage. But so is the belief that random chance is necessary in divination, i.e., Ouija boards, tarot decks, throwing bones, reading tea leaves, and so forth. I believe that this goes hand in hand with the idea that random chance plays an important role in the way that fate controls a person's life and destiny. Rota fortunae is a concept in classical and medieval philosophy which translates most accurately in English to the wheel of the goddess Fortuna is a well-known symbol for the capricious nature of fate. Some are raised up to the wheel's highest point, while others descend to the lowest, all in a single turn of fortune's fickle wheel. It was such a popular concept in the ancient world that Roman historian Tacitus remarked on its overuse in a short work, Dialogus de Oratoribus. It was so popular that the Wheel of Fate made its transition from Hellenistic meme into medieval concept used in aiding of religious instructions, including being used in such famous works of the period as the Canterbury Tales and the Carmina Burana, where it was further immortalized by Karl Orff in the opening of his 1936 classic music adaptation of the Buranum Codex entitled O Fortuna, a song that was further immortalized by its use in several films such as Glory, The Hunt for Red October, The Doors, Natural Born Killers, Detroit Rock City, Jackass the Movie, Cheaper by the Dozen, and G-Force. William Shakespeare makes allusions to Fortuna and her outrageous slings and arrows in the famous monologue from Hamlet, and in his play Henry V he makes even more obvious allusions to fate and her wheel, wherein the character Fluellen and Pistol remark,
Here is the man. Cap, I thee beseech to do me favours. The Duke of Exeter doth love thee well.
And I thank God, and I have earned some love at his hands.
Bardolph, a soldier firm and sound of heart, of buxom valour, hath my cruel fate and giddy fortune's furious fickle wheel, the goddess blind that stands alone upon the rolling red.
By your patience! Out your pistol! Fortune Fortune is painted blind with a muffler for her eyes to signify to you that Fortune is blind. And she is painted also with a wheel to signify to you that she is turning and variation and mutability. And her foot, look you, is fixed upon a spherical stone, which rolls and rolls and rolls. In good truth, the poet makes a most excellent description of it. Fortune is an excellent.
The Wheel of Fortune seemed to be a predominant metaphor for life up until a new challenger appeared in the 16th century, but more on that in the next episode. The Wheel of Fortune is a concept that remains popular today, whether it's referenced in a Grateful Dead song, a Journey song, a Pearl Jam song, or as a set piece in a Mad Max film, a Coen Brothers film, or an episode of Xena Warrior Princess, an entire game show, or even a card in Magic the Gathering that forces everyone to discard their hand and draw again. I hate that card so mother... And so in summary of my brief introduction here, because we're almost 10 minutes in and I haven't started talking about dice yet, the concept of random chance and fate is one that is inherent to the very nature of role-playing games, and perhaps even the human condition itself. Dice are the tools by which the players and game masters tempt Fortuna and her cruel wheel of fate, and this is perhaps the core thesis of the hobby of role-playing itself, and what I feel makes it most interesting, and what allows it to feel real. As Gary Gygax once said, random chance plays a huge part in everybody's life. We all know about the 7 dice set that makes up the bulk of every hobbyist collection. The D4, the D6, the D10 and the D percentile, as well as the D12 and the very well-known D20. We all remember the first time we encountered them. Some of us have separated our first dice set from the rest of our collection. Some of us make towers out of them to imbue them with luck. Others sacrifice dice in full view of the rest of their collection to drive the point that betrayal will not be tolerated. But Dungeon Crawl Classics does something special that no game, in my opinion, has done as well. It's added new dice. Not dice with new symbols, not dice with new numbering conventions, not dice with new gimmicks, but new dice. Dice I had never even heard of before. In addition to the traditional 7, there's the D3, the D5, the D7, the D14, the D16, the D24, the D30. They've basically doubled the amount of dice you need to play the game. But naturally, you don't need these dice. There are alternative ways of generating a digit between 1 and 7 after all. Or even 1 in 30, or 16 or 14. But this expanded chain of dice allows for some pretty amazing things at the table by simplifying one of the more complex concepts in the hobby of role-playing. Let's say you're a character trying to shoot a goblin with an arrow. The goblin is 50 feet away from you, and it's running away from you at a speed of 30 feet per round. This leaves the goblin right in your short distance range, allowing you to attack using your D20. You get to add a +3 from your agility, a +1 from your bow, and a +4 from some random class abilities or spell abilities you may have. The goblin is wearing some typical goblin male armor and has an AC of 12, meaning you have to roll at least a 4 to hit the goblin and do some damage. That's an 80% chance to hit, assuming you are using a perfect die, but more on that a little later. For a judge, this is the best case scenario in a traditional RPG. It's a very straightforward situation that requires very little adjudication on your part. However, it is a tad boring, so let's spice it up a little bit. Let's say the goblin is running away through a jungle instead of a dungeon, and that the ranger is standing 50 feet away but also 60 feet up a cliff, and it's raining and also nighttime. So the goblin has cover, which increases their effective AC to 14, but the ranger is dealing with wind and rain and low light, which should impart a pretty substantial negative modifier. That's a -2 for wind, -2 for rain. Maybe the player has dark vision or some other spell that offsets the darkness of a moonless night, but the rest of that all gets stacked on top of the math the player has already done, which is going to give them a +4. That means they need to roll at least a 10 now, which gives them a 50% chance to succeed on a d20 roll. Following me so far? By adding only a sentence of description, we created a time sink at the table that, for a single round of combat, just isn't worth it. And when being interesting isn't worth it, something's wrong at the table. But let's look at how DCC fixes that by adding more dice. At the judge's discretion, the wind, rain, and darkness would impart, let's say at my table, a -1 dice, -2. Meaning the player, instead of rolling a d20, is going to roll a d16 with an additional -2. That means their +8 is going to become a +6, meaning they need to roll at least an 8 to hit 14, which means they have a 50% chance to succeed on their attack roll, but they are no longer able to crit since it's impossible to roll a natural 20 on a d16. The situation is resolved not only easier, quicker, and more naturally at the table, but by not allowing a player to crit if they are up against odds that are too great. It's actually more realistic in terms of combat, which is something I hadn't considered before writing this essay, and definitely something I didn't expect from a game like DCC. Dungeon Crawl Classic's use of additional polyhedrals to all but remove complex statistical modifier equations at the table frees up some space for some of the more crunchy aspects of the game, like spell casting, critical hits, mighty deeds, and so forth. It's a turnoff for some people, sure, and it was for me at first, but when you're at a DCC table where everything in the game is running the way it should be, the dice, the spells, the crit tables, the short modules, you realize that it's a role-playing game where you can get a lot done in a 4-hour session, all the while going with the flow of your players and keeping the excitement up for that entire duration. And one of the most major things that allows the game to function like that are these dice. As gamers, we rely on dice, but what if these dice weren't as random as we were led to believe? What if Fortune's wheel itself was lopsided and open to manipulation? Such an issue could threaten the very fabric of our shared multiverse. And what if only one man was able to stop it?
Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a big round of applause for Zaki the Magician!
My name is Louis Zaki, and I'm here to tell you some things I think you don't know about polyhedra dice shapes. I was the first person to make polyhedra dice in the United States back in 1974, and in 1980, 6 of the people that I was selling dice to and had been building their reputations as excellent dice manufacturers were telling people that they were making my dice, and that's how they got into the dice business, and that's how most of the people who are in the dice business today got there.
Lou has been talking about polyhedral dice longer than anyone else alive in America. He started making them in 1974 and continues to sell them today. He's possibly best known for his 2 hobbyist inventions, the D-Total and the D-100, also known as the Zaki-hedron. The D-Total is a 24-sided dice wherein each face is printed with the possible outcome of 13 different dice, which for me means the only dice I need at the table is a D-Total, a D20, a D16, a D14, and a D30, cutting my dice chain from 14 to 5. Some of these dice don't evenly distribute to 24 sides, so a re-roll might need to be made once or twice. But not only does this cut my dice chain down by more than half, it doesn't require a screen because no one knows which of the 13 dice was being rolled except me. The Zakihedron is another amazing invention which takes the place of the two 10-sided dice needed for generating numbers between 1 and 100. It replaces them with a single dice with 100 sides. It's filled with a stopping mechanism made up of something that makes them sound similar to maracas when you shake them. I'm not 100% sure what this stopping mechanism is, and I'm not willing to break my Zakihedron to find out. A test published in White Dwarf magazine found that the distribution of rolls wasn't exactly even. However, after this test was published, there have been changes to the way the numbers are printed on the dice to make them more uniform, if not still a bit imperfect. But can a dice be perfect? Are your dice perfect? Are mine? Have we ever bothered to check? How does one test a dice other than rolling it thousands of times and recording the results? Lou Zaki knows the answer. As he puts it, a dice is meant to grant equal access to all the digits available on a given design. But according to the test Lou has created and his intimate knowledge of how dice are made, he is able to tell us exactly why the dice you bought at your local hobby shop are more than likely lopsided, uneven, and unable to generate perfectly random numbers.
People come up and they say, "What's the matter with you? Every one of these dice has got a little bitty blemish at the bottom. Why, God bless America, if you knew what you were doing, you could get rid of that blemish. Don't you realize how badly that's going to make the dice roll? Other people can make dice without that problem. Why can't you make that dice without problem?" So I have to tell them the facts of life are that, improbable as it may seem, dice, just like plastic model airplanes and plastic model tanks and plastic model cars, are cast on a casting runner. And you have to clip it off the casting runner in order to get it separated. And this is the result of what happens after you cut it free. But because all my competitors are using a shortcut to get ink into the digits, they don't seem to have that problem, but they do. And so the first thing they do is they put their dice into a rock polisher and they tumble them with a very coarse material to polish off that blemish, because if they don't, paint's going to lodge in there and it's going to be very obvious. After they have tumbled them to remove that blemish, they put the dice into a French fry basket and immerse the French fry basket into the bottom of a paint bucket. When they pull it out, every dice in that French fry basket is coated with paint, and it's now red or white or black, whatever the paint color was. After the dice have dried, they're put back into that same rock polisher and they're tumbled again, because you don't want all that paint. What you want is a contrasting color in the digit. And so the second tumbling removes all the unwanted paint from the outside of the dice. And at the same time, it's destroying all the edges on the dice, and it's removing the vertices on the dice. But that's okay. When the dice have finished tumbling that second time, they now have blemishes, scars, and unsightly scratches all over the surfaces, which nobody likes to look at. So then they put the dice back into a rock polisher, only this time the rock polisher's got a very fine medium, and it tries to polish the dice and bring them back to a more acceptable appearance. Now, as a result of having put those dice in that rock polisher 3 times, this is what comes out. The first stack of dice you see there were dice that I took out of Redbox Dungeons and Dragons, and I stacked them on top of each other, and then I took 10 more dice out of Redbox Dungeons and Dragons and stacked them on top of each other. It should be apparent that the first stack is 3/4 of an inch taller than the second stack. If all those dice came from the same source, why don't they reach the same height? And the answer to that question is because all those dice are egg-shaped. And the dice in the first stack were stacked with the number 1 facing the number 20, while all the dice in the second stack were stacked with the number 9 facing the number 12. Which means that the dice are going to behave like everything else in nature. They're going to try to find their lowest center of gravity when they're rolled. Those dice will roll lots of 9s and 12s and very few 1s and 20s. If this was a dice and you threw it, would you really expect that dice to land like this as often as it lands like that? would you expect it to land as often like this as it lands like that? And the answer is no. When you take an egg out of a carton, it always rolls over on its side because gravity is pulling it down to its lowest center of gravity. And that's what's happening with dice as well. So a lot of game masters prematurely kill off characters that deserve to live, but the game masters are using rounded edge dice that cannot roll saving numbers. And you probably heard the story of the game master turns to the player and he says, "George, your character's dead unless you can roll a 20 and save him." And George says, "Gee, where's my green 20? That's the one that always rolls high." And he pulls it out, rolls it, and he saves more often than the law of averages says he should, because that dice is short on the 120 axis, and that's why it rolls more 20s. So,
Lou makes great dice. As a matter of fact, the only set of dice I have in my collection that is even comparable to the quality of Lou's dice is Ultrapro's airplane-grade aluminum gravity dice that are actually capable of standing up on a corner. However, Ultrapro comes up short by only producing 6-sided dice of this quality, and a 2-dice set from Ultrapro will cost you nearly twice as much as a set of plain game science dice. Lou was also the inventor of clear gem-style dice as well, and he made sure to produce dice as close to perfect quality as one can get outside of NASA or a casino.
now as you look at this dice, you can see that it has lots of luster and fire. And if you went to any of my competitors' booths, you would notice that every one of them has a great big lamp shining down on their display to make the dice look as lustrous as mine. But I don't have a big lamp, and I don't need one because I'm using the premium grade materials. And the premium grade materials cost more than the cheap stuff they're using, and so they can't get to the lustrous appearance that I have. Now,
Yes, he created the rather maligned D50, a dice which I have grown to love for its more obtuse qualities and atypical rolling style. But his dice also offer an element of mathematical probability not afforded to you by the smooth-edged dice of the more popular manufacturers, and the company he founded, Game Science, continues to offer top-of-the-line dice via their website to this day. However, in January of 2020, a fire destroyed the storage space where Lou kept his gaming supplies, games, magazines, parts, and memorabilia collected over his life in our hobby. No one was hurt in the fire, but I am still filled with sorrow to think at the wealth of information that was lost. I've had the absolute pleasure of meeting Lou on 2 occasions. Both times were at Gen Con, and if his booth was any indication, the loss of his garage is akin to the burning of the Library of Alexandria for our hobby. I still have dice purchased from him. I still have some cool old publications that I purchased from him as well, but to think that a future year's Gen Con attendees may miss out on the priceless Mythos for sale at the booth of one of the last of the old guard of the hobby. The guy whose dice still need to be painted by hand because he refuses to do anything to them that would mess with their probabilities. The guy who invented some of the dice we still use today. It's a terrible thought that the loss of such an ephemeral object collection could cause ripples through a community of people. That something as random as a garage fire could bring about a loss the cost of which we may never truly know. But that is the fickle nature of Fortuna and her cruel wheel. But it is by reaching across that wheel to those less fortunate than us and offering help that we may try to change fate. Shortly after the fire, a GoFundMe was started to help source a recovery fund for Lou. In a period of about a month, they were able to raise $5.2K for the former game and dice designer. As I have said, I've met Lou on 2 occasions, and he really is an incredible person. He's always doing magic tricks or showing off dice, old gaming materials, or telling really long but really interesting stories about the history of our hobby. He really is a treasure, and I hope that I will be able to see him again on the convention floor someday. Thank you so much for watching my dice video. There's a larger conversation to be had about dice. There's a lot of history that I left out. I never talked about casino dice or the ancient board games of Babylon, but I feel like I was able to craft an interesting narrative that came in just under the half-hour mark, which is what I was shooting for. If you'd like to know more about the history of dice, then I recommend doing some of your own research. It's a topic that I plan on talking about again in the future, but it's something that I'm going to need to do more reading about before I make another video, so get yourself to your local library. If you'd like to purchase your own official Dungeon Crawl Classics Funky Dice set, then you can do so from goodmangames.com or from Impact Miniatures. If you'd like to purchase some Game Science polyhedrons, then head on down to gamescience.com. They've got a great selection. I really recommend getting yourself some gem dice. Thank you again so much for watching this video. It, along with all my content, is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers, who have exclusive access to my Discord, and the kind comments of viewers like you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And good night out there, wherever you are.